So first, I want to promise to make education great again. We're gonna have the best schools. We're gonna hire the best teachers, the best principals, and Mexico is going to pay for all of it. Sorry, those are the wrong notes. First, I want to step back and I want to talk about the system in general. So about 30 years ago, the Reagan administration released a report, A Nation at Risk, which found if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. So Ted Cruz would have carpet bombed all of the schools had he been president at the time. So what's happened in the 30 years since then? Well, there was a study, this is from Harvard University, but it's based on the findings of the 2011 PISA, which is an international exam. And here you have all of the different industrialized nations that took the exam mixed in with some of our states. You see Massachusetts did the best out of all of our states, but the US average is actually on page 2. We were 32nd in math. If you want to find Washington, D.C., there it is, the very last, behind all of the other states, sandwiched in between Thailand and Mexico. That's what about $30,000 per year per pupil will get you. So maybe this is because DC is spending too much, but maybe the other states aren't spending enough. But if you actually compare performance and resources, you see that there is no strong correlation. So all of the nations that are in the top left quadrant there are spending less per pupil than the United States, but have higher performance per pupil on the PISA. There's actually a lot of research that shows that just spending more money is not the solution. As a matter of fact, if you look at spending in the United States over the last several decades, since 1970, adjusted for inflation, we've just about tripled the amount that we're spending per pupil. Now, part of that, of course, would be explained by the introduction of special needs students, but that's a small percentage overall. And test scores, if you look at the NAEP, the Nation's Report Card for 17-year-olds, the students that are just about completed their high school education, we see that the test scores pretty much over that period were flat. So what's the solution? Milton Friedman had a theory that just as in other markets, if you had freedom, if you had competition, if you had choice, you would have a system that would produce innovation and greater efficiency and higher quality. And no state has actually put Milton Friedman's vision of a universal voucher program into effect, but a few have come not close, but have had smaller programs that are, even the ones that have wide eligibility tend to attract right now a smaller number of students. But we find that the performance on gold standard studies, we find evidence that there is a positive impact on performance. Here we have all of the studies up until this year anyway, showing all of them showed a positive impact. Many on average for all students, some only for certain subcategories of students, usually low-income minority students who are the most choice-deprived initially. Only one study found no visible effect until this year, where we had the 2 studies of Louisiana that found a negative impact on those students. In terms of the impact on public schools, we have about 24 studies, not randomized controlled trial because you can't force districts to adopt one policy or another, but we have all of them found a positive effect. Usually, again, very modest, but statistically significant, one that found no visible impact. Even the Louisiana study found a positive impact on the public school students. So what went wrong in Louisiana? There are certainly a number of factors at play. The 2 previous speakers identified several of them. I would like to look in particular at the theory that regulation is behind a lot of this. So first we look at the private schools that participated, and we find that very few private schools participated, only 1/3. Now, it could be, as Dr. Harris said, that some of these schools anyway weren't interested in serving low-income students, but we find that in other states that have programs that are serving low-income students, Florida, for example, where they have a scholarship tax credit program for low-income students, we see that 60% of the schools in the state are participating. And in Indiana, which has a voucher program statewide, they have 50% participation. Louisiana, it has a very small number of schools that participate. And we find that there is a difference between these two different categories of students, or schools. The schools that chose not to accept voucher students, on average, had a 3% rate of growth in the last decade, and the schools that did participate saw a decrease on average of about 13%. Now, if the enrollment trends are a rough proxy, we can't prove this, but if they are a rough proxy, then it would suggest that the higher quality schools chose not to participate while lower quality schools chose to participate. And we have to ask, why is that? Now, the study itself did a check, and it looked at the difference in performance among the participating schools and found that there was no correlation among the participating schools between their growth or decline in enrollment and their performance. So these are hypothetical numbers. So you could plot these and you could find a low R squared, in other words, a low correlation. But if you were to step back and look at the entire picture, if this theory is right, that regulation was keeping the higher quality schools out, you very well might see a higher correlation. Again, we don't know, we don't have this data. This is what we would predict, but again, these aren't real figures up here. So then why did so few schools participate? I do think it comes down to two things, money and regulations, in addition to the other things that we talked about, but we'll look at these two. So the school choice regulations, as they mentioned earlier, that private schools are not allowed to set their own admissions standards. They have to, if they're oversubscribed, they have to have a lottery and accept whoever shows up. Also, they have to teach the state test, which is aligned to the state curriculum. Now, Dr. Wolf, along with a few colleagues, did a study for the American Enterprise Institute where they asked, they surveyed private schools, they asked non-participating private schools, why didn't you participate? The number one reason was fear of future regulations, but we saw a lot of things, the amount of required paperwork and reports, concerns about testing, requirements to teach the state's curriculum, concerns about administering the state accountability test. All of these are, more than 50% say that it played a role in the decision not to participate. All of these essentially have to do with regulations and testing, and many of the other top ones have to do with their character or identity, in other words, related to the admission standards. So students might not be prepared for our academic rigor, the effect on our independence, character, identity, the effect on our school's admissions policies, the effect of participation on our academic standards, maintaining the school's religious identity, and that students might not be able to pass the admissions tests. And so they actually have some data to back this up as well. So they asked schools that were participating, how has participation in the scholarship program changed your school's approach to standardized testing? Now, this is again among the participating schools. And we see that testing in Louisiana increased dramatically in the participating schools, which we didn't see in these other states, Florida and Indiana. So we would expect actually that the test scores are likely to rise over the next few years, but that's not showing necessarily an improvement in the quality of the schools so much as the adjustment to the test. So I definitely buy Professor Harris's theory that testing plays a role here, but if testing plays a role in the original negative result, then testing is also going to explain a good chunk of the improvement in the second and third year. On the money side of things, the average voucher was about $5,000, which is about half of what they were spending in the public schools per pupil. But this is actually a price ceiling, not the $5,000, but it's either the lesser of what they were charging before in tuition or 90% of the state and local funding per student of the school's district school. Now, what happens when you have a price ceiling? Well, basic economics, here we have supply, demand, and the price ceiling, and it leads to a shortage. Again, this is suggestive but not conclusive. We don't know that this is actually what's going on, but this is what economic theory would predict. And we do see that this is a question asking school, has your school had to turn away scholarship students due to excess demand? And we see that in Louisiana, this is much more the case. About 4 out of 10 schools said, yes, we had to turn away students because of excess demand than in other states. And since joining the program, how has the number of scholarship students in your school that your school enrolls changed? Less than half said the number has increased, and a sizable number said it has actually stayed the same or even decreased. Moreover, what about your future plans for enrolling students? Very few, only 2 out of 10 said that they were going to increase enrollment for scholarship students, whereas in other states they're saying, yes, bring them in. So in other words, you have a situation where they're filling, for the most part, empty seats. They're reversing some of their negative enrollment trends, but they're not expanding. They're not growing. Now, if we want a system, if we want an education system that fosters innovation and that grows to scale, I think that what we need is a market. We need schools to have the freedom to set the curriculum that they believe is best, and we need parents to have the freedom to choose among those schools. And over time, like in other markets, those better schools are going to attract more students. There's going to be an incentive for them to grow. Right now, unfortunately, with the subsidized district school system as the 800-pound gorilla in the room, it crowds out these other alternatives. So I believe, this is not just a belief, this is based on the evidence from numerous other, pretty much every other type of market, where there are also information asymmetry problems, where we also have concerns about equity, but we find that the market does a better job of delivering for everybody, including the poor.